What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be discussing my top 40 running backs for redraft fantasy football leagues. As you guys know, your drafts are going to be right around the corner, maybe even this weekend or the upcoming weekend as the NFL season approaches. We've done the quarterbacks, the tight ends, running backs on tap today, and then wide receivers shortly after. But without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video. Let's start talking about these running backs. So as you guys can see, I have the tier maker pulled up on the screen as we speak. I have 9 tiers to get through my top 40 running backs in today's episode. So without wasting that time, let's hop right into the tier 1. And tier 1, it only has one guy in this tier for me. This is going to be Christian McCaffrey of the San Francisco 49ers. I mean, it goes without saying, yes, he has a little bit of a calf injury at the moment, not too worried about it. Last season, he averaged 22.4 fantasy points per game. He was by far and away the most dominant fantasy football running back in your leagues. It's not really going to change this year. As long as he is healthy, he is going to see a massive workload in San Francisco, and you should be drafting him comfortably as the 101 in your fantasy football drafts. Now, going on to tier 2, I have 2 guys in this tier as well. The players we're going to talk about are going to be Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson. I don't really care which order you put these guys in. I have Breece as 2 and Bijan as number 3. But last season, Breece Hall, dominant, recovering from the ACL, didn't matter. He still averaged 15 fantasy points per game. Bijan, kind of the Arthur Smith problem, but that is no longer there. He averaged 13 fantasy points per game almost with Arthur Smith still there. So shouldn't really be an issue in 2024 with this new coaching staff. I think these are going to be the first 3 running backs off the board in your drafts. I think they should be the first 3 off the board. These guys are going to be elite, no questions asked. But that takes us to tier 3, and tier 3 is a little bit more interesting. You have Jonathon Taylor here as my running back 4, Jahmyr Gibbs is my running back 5, and I have Saquon Barkley here as my running back 6. Now, all of these guys were kind of in that 14 to 15 fantasy points per game range last year. Jahmyr Gibbs, the rookie that breaks out. Jonathon Taylor banged up throughout the year, but when he was on the field, he was still a very big difference maker for our fantasy football teams, and they have the rookie there with Anthony Richardson under center. Saquon Barkley is the most interesting of these guys because he moves on from the New York Giants, who we know hasn't necessarily been a place where they score a lot of fantasy football points. Well, now he goes to Philadelphia, the division rivals, and you go to a situation where we know that the efficiency of the offense is going to be much better than it was in New York. I think Saquon, people are going to have the issue with maybe the Jalen Hurts tush push, maybe him vulturing some of the touchdowns. I don't think it's going to matter that much. I think he is going to be so good for fantasy football, and I think as long as he is healthy, which is the thing with most of these running backs, I probably don't even need to keep saying that. As long as he's healthy, he is going to be very good. I think he has top 5 potential in 2024, but I have him right now as my RB6 in my pre-draft rankings. So now that we have gotten out of the top 6, the top 3 tiers, I have 4 guys in my tier 4. We'll talk about them. Kyren Williams is my running back 7. My running back 8, Travis Etienne. Running back 9, Achane. And running back 10, Isiah Pacheco. And this rounds out my top 10 running backs. I think last year, Kyren Williams, the production goes without speaking. 19.9 fantasy points per game. That is much more than any of the guys in this tier. Travis Etienne, Achane, Isiah Pacheco, they're in that 13 to 16 point fantasy points per game range. Kyren Williams outscored them all by a massive amount. Now, there is risk with Kyren Williams. Kyren was kind of one of those anomaly running backs in the first place. He was a guy who wasn't supposed to happen. And now the Los Angeles Rams, they added Blake Corum, who is a very good running back to this backfield in the 3rd round of the NFL draft. That being said, if they bell cow Kyren Williams, which is what I am going to project them to do this year, Kyren Williams is going to be very good for fantasy football. I'm confident taking him as the running back 1 on my team. The only issue is it's a little bit more risky than the guys we talked about above. Now, guys like Travis Etienne and Isiah Pacheco in this tier are a little bit more safe than guys like Kyren Williams and Achane. And Achane is kind of a similar argument to Kyren Williams. The only other issue is that this is a full-blown committee here in Miami. I think Achane is the most talented of those guys, but I don't mind if you decide, hey, I don't want to take the most expensive Miami Dolphins running back. I want the value, and you go for a Raheem Mostert or a Jalen Wright later in your drafts. I don't mind that. Achane, though, he has the ability to break fantasy football. We've seen him score 50-point fantasy football weeks even last year. So I think Achane should be the number 1 back in this backfield, but I understand it could be a committee as well. And when it comes to Etienne and Pacheco, these guys are going to be bell cows in their offenses. The backups behind them aren't that great. Tank Bigsby, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, yes, they could see some run, maybe a little bit. I'm not too worried about it. Etienne, Pacheco, these guys are bell cow running backs in a world in the NFL right now where there's not a lot of bell cows. I think you can draft those guys with confidence as your running back ones. Now, in my tier 5 right here, I have 6 running backs. We have Derrick Henry coming off the board as my running back 11, Jacobs as my running back 12, Mixon my running back 13, Rachaad White my running back 14, James Cook my running back 15, and Alvin Kamara my running back 16. Now, if you wanted to wait on the running back position in your drafts, this tier here is where you can still find guys with running back 1 upside, and you can find some guys in some very good offenses. I mean, you have Derrick Henry in that Baltimore Ravens offense, Jacobs in the Green Bay Packers offense, Joe Mixon in the Houston Texans offense. I think all of these guys are going to be good picks as a running back 1 on your lineup. The only issue is in this tier that I see, Derrick Henry, he has the highest ADP of all of these guys. Now, even though he is the number 1 player in this tier for me, he has a round 2 ADP. So he has the ADPs of the same guys like Kyren Williams, Etienne, Achane, Pacheco, who are all a tier above him. So if you have the chance to draft Derrick Henry, maybe you consider waiting because you have guys like Joe Mixon, Josh Jacobs, Rachaad White, who I all have in this same similar tier that are going in rounds 3 and rounds 4 of your drafts 2 rounds later. So I think Henry, because of the ADP being much higher than the guys in this tier with him, in a way that kind of makes him an avoid for me in my drafts. I just think that there's better value at the running back position. Now, I understand Derrick Henry, he is the Yeti. He is the guy who, when the weather gets cold, he is going to score 2, 3, 4 touchdowns in any given week, and he's going to be dominant for fantasy football. And you put him in a Baltimore Ravens offense that is going to be much better than what he had in Tennessee. The only thing is the 30-year-old age. The wear and tear on the body, it scares me. I think a lot of people are in on Derrick Henry, and I would not be surprised if Derrick Henry goes out and has a dominant year, but I think he has some risk as well. I think in this tier, just looking at the players, Joe Mixon, Rachaad White, they are my favorite targets. You get him in the 4th rounds. We're talking about Rachaad White, who can get a ton of receptions in the air. We saw him do it last year. And Joe Mixon, he's just consistently been good for fantasy football. 14.2 fantasy points per game last year. That would put him as the 2nd highest scoring running back in this tier, behind only Alvin Kamara. And now you have this Houston Texans offense where there really is no depth behind Joe Mixon. It is Dameon Pierce, but he still kind of looks like the odd man out in this offense throughout the preseason. I think Joe Mixon is going to have a ton of touchdown opportunities. I think he's going to have some receiving upside in this offense, and I would not be surprised if Joe Mixon goes out again and gives us a top 10, top 12 season at the running back position, just like he has for many of years. One of my favorite picks, one of my favorite value picks in fantasy football right now. And then I have to address the elephant in the room. I said that Alvin Kamara had the most fantasy points per game of anybody in this tier last season. I just look at the Saints offense this year. Derek Carr under center. I don't expect this to be a good team. Now, Alvin Kamara could have his dump offs that just happen year after year after year, where he continues to have PPR upside. I just don't know how much Alvin Kamara has left in the tank. You look at the rushing efficiencies over the last couple of seasons, he has continued to trend downward each and every year. He's just not that good on the ground anymore. There could be some massive touchdown regression in this offense with less scoring opportunities, a bad team. Maybe they're even switching to Spencer Rattler halfway through the year because Derek Carr is not getting the job done. I think there's a lot of risk in a guy like Alvin Kamara, but at the same time, you're getting him in round 4, the points per game last year. I don't necessarily think he is a full-on avoid, but I just prefer the players in the 4th round over Alvin Kamara, like James Cook, Rachaad White, and Joe Mixon. Now, moving on to tier 6, I have 6 running backs in this tier as well. Kenneth Walker comes off the board as running back 17, DeAndre Swift at 18, Montgomery at 19, James Conner at 20, Najee Harris at 21, and Raheem Mostert as my running back 22. Now, this tier specifically, that tier 5, I talked about there being some value. Tier 6 has the most value of any of these running back tiers in your fantasy football drafts this year. All of these guys have an ADP somewhere between round 5 and round 7, specifically guys like James Conner, Raheem Mostert, Najee Harris, DeAndre Swift. These guys you can get in the 6th and 7th rounds, and I think that they have RB2 with maybe even potentially RB1 upside if a few things go their way. Now let's talk a little bit about DeAndre Swift because I'm higher on him than consensus, and he's a guy that I've been targeting in a ton of fantasy football drafts this year. Last year, obviously, the 11.2 fantasy points per game was on a Philadelphia Eagles offense. He goes to the Chicago Bears where the depth behind him is still up for grabs. Khalil Herbert, currently at the time of this recording, recording, still on the roster. Roschon Johnson has kind of looked like just a jag at this point. I think DeAndre Swift is going to be in line for bell cow usage here in 2024 with the Chicago Bears, and I think he's going to be used in the receiving game a lot as well. The upside with a guy like Swift, who, when he has gotten a lot of usage, has been very valuable for fantasy football, stemming all the way back to his time in Detroit. I think he has the ability to have top 12 upside, and you can get him late in drafts. Now, obviously, I'm not projecting him as a top 12 guy. I have him as my running back 18, but I think the upside is still there nonetheless. A guy that I would feel comfortable with as my RB2 because I know the upside that he possesses. I think the same thing can be said for a guy like James Conner. James Conner in an offense last year that had Kyler Murray off of the field for a majority of the year, and we know it wasn't just that efficient. James Conner still averaged 14.5 fantasy points per game. Now, he does have a 6th-round ADP, so it's higher than DeAndre Swift, higher than Raheem Mostert, higher than Najee Harris in this tier, but you have an upgraded offense as well. Kyler Murray going to play the whole year. I think he is going to be in line for a massive year. You guys know how much I love Kyler Murray this year and this Arizona Cardinals offense. Marvin Harrison Jr., probably one of the better wide receivers that Kyler Murray has ever played with. James Conner profiles to be the goal line back in this offense. I think he even profiles to be the bell cow in this offense despite the Trey Benson pick this year. He is a guy who could very well have 15 plus fantasy points per game in 2024 and give you that running back 1 production at a running back 2 price in your drafts. So James Conner, another guy that I definitely want to target in my drafts. I think he has some sleeper upside in 2024. The same thing can be said for Raheem Mostert. Look, we need to talk about this Miami Dolphins offense. As I mentioned with Achane, they have been absolutely incredible in the run game. And Raheem Mostert last year, he averaged 17 fantasy points per game. Now, obviously, a lot of that came with some touchdowns. He had an incredible touchdown year. You don't know if that's going to happen again. The likelihood of that happening again is actually probably pretty low, but I think he can still be efficient. People are kind of writing him off, so I think we should still consider Raheem Mostert as the RB2, maybe even the RB1B in this offense, and I think he still has a ton of upside. Definitely a value pick in your drafts. Now, let's move on to tier 7 here. 6 more running backs to talk about. We got Aaron Jones as the running back 23, Zamir White, my running back 24, Jonathan Brooks, my running back 25, Tony Pollard, my running back 26, 27 is Rhamondre Stevenson, and 28 is Javonte Williams. Now, this tier is a very risky tier, and there's not a lot of picks that I like in this tier. In fact, Aaron Jones, I have him much lower than ADP right now. He is an avoid in my list. Rhamondre Stevenson, I also have him lower. I think that there's some Antonio Gibson issues that are going to present themselves for Rhamondre Stevenson. I have him as an avoid as well. But Javonte Williams, he is a sleeper for me. You talk about how Sean Payton uses his running backs, and last year the Denver Broncos led the NFL in running back targets in the passing game. Now, I think Javonte Williams, obviously he is still recovering from that knee injury, but he is much further along than he was last year. Last year, averaging almost 10 fantasy points per game. That would have been the same as Rhamondre Stevenson. That would have been the same as Aaron Jones last year as well. You got to consider the fact that he's healthier, and they potentially have an upgrade here in Bo Nix under center for the Denver Broncos. I think Javonte Williams, if he does get that pass catching upside, if he does get the receptions, if he gets some of the goal line work, we could be looking at a much better year for Javonte Williams in 2024 than we had in 2023, and he could be a small little value, maybe a sleeper pick for you in your drafts. Now, the other player that we should really talk about in this tier is Jonathan Brooks, because Jonathan Brooks was the first running back drafted off of the board in the 2024 NFL draft. Now, he is recovering from an ACL injury as well. I think it's going to take some time for Jonathan Brooks to get on the field, but I'm comfortable drafting him here as my running back 25 because I think the end of the year could still be big for Jonathan Brooks. It just might take a month or so for him to get rolling. The reality is, you look at Dave Canales, you look at how he uses his running backs. Keep in mind, he was coaching in Tampa Bay last year when Rachaad White had his big season, catching the football out of the backfield, running the football, the goal line opportunities. They're going to do the same thing with Jonathan Brooks when he's healthy. It's just going to be a matter of when, not if they do it. So I do think that Jonathan Brooks has some upside, maybe later in the season than he does in the early parts of the year, but I'm comfortable drafting him, especially if you're able to grab him as your running back 3, because maybe you were able to draft a guy in tier 5 or 6, and maybe a guy in tier 3 or 4 as well as your first 2 running backs. I'm comfortable with Brooks as the 3rd. Now, when it comes to guys like Jones and Zamir White, I just don't don't think the offenses are going to be good enough to support the upside that we want out of a running back pick at this point of the draft. And Tony Pollard, I think, is going to be cannibalized by a committee that does have Tajay Spears, who I'm a fan of, who I think is very talented in his own right. So those guys, they kind of just don't have the upside that I want to pick, but they are going to be good enough throughout the year that you can draft them in this tier of players. Now, tier 8 for me is going to have 7 running backs. We're going to start it off with Devin Singletary as my running back 29, Brian Robinson 30, Jaylen Warren 31, Tajay Spears 32, Nick Chubb 33, Chase Brown 34, and Zach Moss 35. That kind of sums up this tier for me. Now, again, there's a few players in this tier that I think you should target over the rest. Devin Singletary is one of them. Last year, he averaged 9 fantasy points per game. He has about around 9 ADP right now, which is later than guys like Jaylen Warren, Brian Robinson, Tajay Spears, Zach Moss, who are in the same tier. So you're getting a little bit of a value with the selection of Devin Singletary. We kind of have this battle between Tyrone Tracy Jr. and Eric Gray. It does seem like Eric Gray is winning that in the preseason, maybe by default due to the Tracy injury. But Devin Singletary, he was brought in by this coaching staff. Brian Daboll coached him in Buffalo. I think he is going to be fine. This offense shouldn't be fantastic. There shouldn't be a ton of scoring opportunities unless Daniel Jones takes a major step forward, which so far, based on his first preseason game, maybe won't happen. I just think that Devin Singletary will see some volume, maybe not a lot of upside, but you can still draft him just purely based off of the opportunities, and I have him as my running back 29 because of that. Now, Brian Robinson, he's kind of the same idea. Last year, averaged a little bit more fantasy points per game than a guy like Devin Singletary. The issue is they bring in Austin Eckler, and although I don't think Austin Eckler is the same Austin Eckler that he's been in years past, it does cap the PPR upside of a guy like Brian Robinson. Maybe not going to be used in the passing game as much as he was last year. And you have a guy in Jaden Daniels who's probably not going to check the football down as much as guys did last year in Sam Howell. But again, he's going to be good enough on the ground. He's going to have enough touchdown opportunities, and he's going to be the goal line back in those opportunities that I think he is going to be worthy of a selection. But you're more so looking at a kind of low ceiling running back 3 on your lineup more than anything else. Now, Jaylen Warren, Tajay Spears, Chase Brown, all of these guys, you can even group in Zach Moss with that. They're in committees, but I think these guys are the RB2s in the committees, or just with Chase Brown and Zach Moss. I don't really know who's going to be the RB1 yet as of the time of this recording. I assume it's going to be Chase Brown. I think he's a little bit more electric than a guy like Zach Moss, but these guys are more so running backs that if an injury happens to the starter, they will see a major increase in their value, but you can't draft them as that. They're like high-end handcuffs to me in my drafts. So those are the guys that I think should be in this tier. And then Nick Chubb, unfortunately for Nick Chubb, he had the gruesome knee injury. I don't think he's going to play week 1. It could be a while before they ramp him up. I just don't know if he's even going to have the same pop, the same electricity that he played with before, the power that he played with before. It's unfortunate. This late in his career, that type of knee injury, oftentimes the correct bet is to bet against the player that suffers the injury at this time in their career. And unfortunately, as much as I like Nick Chubb, I think it is the right move to bet against him in 2024, and maybe even further than that. We may have seen the best days of Nick Chubb ahead of us. Although that being said, I hope Nick Chubb has a great end of the year. I hope he is better in the second half than he is in the first half as he gets a little bit healthier. But as far as drafting, I'm probably avoiding Nick Chubb in my drafts. And now the last and final tier, tier 9, just to get to my running back 40. You have Jerome Ford, Gus Edwards, Ezekiel Elliott, Chuba Hubbard, and Zach Charbonnet to round this out. Now, Jerome Ford, he's interesting. I think just based off of what we just talked about with Nick Chubb, you can draft Jerome Ford and hope maybe he gets some playing time early in the year and keeps the playing time as the year goes on. Last year, when he filled in for Chubb, 11.1 fantasy points per game. He has about around 10 ADP right now. So I think Jerome Ford is a fine dart throw later in your drafts if you're trying to find some value at the running back position. The same can kind of be said for Gus Edwards and Ezekiel Elliott. These are older running backs that are likely going to be using these running backs on the goal line. I don't know how good that Chargers team is going to be for fantasy football, how much they are going to score in these games, but they are projected at about 8.5 wins right now by Vegas, so they should have enough wins under their belt to have Gus Edwards have some relevancy. There is a guy in J.K. Dobbins that could cannibalize some of this, and with Ezekiel Elliott, there's a guy like Rico Dowdle who could cannibalize some of that as well. I think these guys are risky, probably don't have any ceiling, but you can get some games out of them, especially if there's an injury to one of the other backs in their backfield. And last but not least, Charbonnet and Chuba Hubbard. I think these guys are handcuffs, but Chuba Hubbard we can group more so as the Jerome Ford tier. Jerome, we think he's going to be the starter week 1. I think Chuba is going to be the starter week 1 with Jonathan Brooks out recovering from that injury. Zach Charbonnet, a high-end handcuff. If anything happens to Kenneth Walker, the draft capital for Charbonnet, the talent of Charbonnet, it should speak for itself. He should have a massive opportunity, but he is just a handcuff. You're not really drafting him to be a immediate starter week 1 in your fantasy football lineup. So there you have it. That's my top 40 running backs for redraft fantasy football right now. As you can see, 9 tiers, lots of solid running backs. I think there are some great tiers to target in your drafts. That tier 4 has some good value. Tier 5, tier 6, those tiers specifically, tiers 4 through 6, they have the most value in my opinion. Probably want to grab 2 running backs in those groupings of players there. But there you have it. That is it for today's video. As I mentioned, we've already done the quarterbacks and the tight end rankings for your redraft fantasy football leagues. If you haven't watched those, I strongly suggest you go check them out on the channel. If you did enjoy today's video, go ahead and hit that like button. It is the best free way to show this channel some support. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button as well. Giving you lots of content, trying to help you guys win your fantasy football championships this year. And if you haven't subscribed already, we have a goal of 3,000 subscribers by week 1. Hoping you guys can help us hit that. So as I mentioned, if you haven't done it already, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell. And last but not least, if you haven't joined our Discord, I do have a free Discord linked in the description. I'm in there helping you guys with your fantasy football drafts, waivers, trades, all of that good stuff for fantasy football. And like I said, it is free to join. Just go to the link in the description and click join. And with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.